Hello, everyone. I did my presentation and book report on the book Scarcity. The book is written by Sendil Mohanathan and Eldar Shafir, and I'm Brian Wainwright. So, just a little bit about the authors. Sendil Mohanathan was the primary author on the book. A little background on him: he's an economics teacher at Harvard University, and Scarcity is one of his most famous publications to date. And assisting him on this project was Eldar Shafir. Eldar Shafir is a professor at Princeton University, and he has interests in American behavioral science and public policy as well as psychology, which he teaches at Princeton. So, the basic thesis of scarcity, the key point of the book is the emphasis of having less and the science of how we live our lives based on what we have. That's kind of the underlying premise of the whole book, and the whole topic kind of just rolls off of that. Amongst that, they also discuss some other major key concepts and theories that they sort of subject and incorporate into the book. The major topics that I kind of will talk about in this presentation is getting the most out of what you have, tunneling and the tax effect, focus and its dividend, slack, bandwidth, trade-offs, and associated taxes with all three, and then myopic short-run behaviors and their impacts on investments. So the first topic is getting the most out of what we have. The major thing that this sort of discussed was the impact of deadlines in our society. And time is basically a scarce resource. And as everybody knows, you only have so much time in the day. So it talked about the incorporation of how deadlines kind of start encouraging productivity amongst individuals and really push us to be more productive. And, if you have a lot of time before a project's actually due, you're more likely to kind of procrastinate that and push it back. And that's sort of an ongoing thing until it becomes, a week due. And in different group projects, you see it all the time, especially on a college campus where everybody's starting to kind of scurry together to get their project done. So that's kind of one of the major examples that he provides in his book about this is the pressure of deadlines and how they increase productivity and they increase scarcity outcomes. So one of the major topics in the book is focus and the focus dividend. So focus kind of is something that derives from getting the most of what we have. As those deadlines that we have kind of start approaching, what we do subconsciously in our mind is we start ranking these different deadlines based on when they're kind of coming in. So when I say mental ranking, it's a process that our brain applies to upcoming responsibilities and assignments that we might have done. You see it. Another example is like on the college campuses. You see, students don't immediately do homework right after the class in which they were in the lecture because it's not due the next day, it's due 2 days from then. So that's kind of an application of how deadlines kind of revolve around focus. And the workplace implication of this is the same type of concept as to when you have more time at your disposal, you're going to focus on the things that are due first. And that's kind of the major concept of focus. There also was a food scarcity study where they found similar findings with men around World War II. So what they did was they deprived these men of food for about 30 days, I think, and just giving them the bare minimum to survive. And what they found. So the other major topic in this concept of tunneling is tunneling and neglect. So the example that the author kind of gives is with firefighters when they're rushing into a fire. So when the bell sounds and everything like that, they're so focused on being efficient and getting everything ready as quick as possible that they can get to the scene of the fire and they strategize in the car. And on that car ride there, they tend to often have certain things that they don't do. So in the example provided in the book, what happens is that all these firemen rush out to get ready to go to the scene, and one of the members doesn't buckle his seatbelt because he's not focused on that. He's focused on getting everything ready and being assured of himself that when he gets to the scene of the incident, he's ready to go and he's prepared for what's going to be awaiting him. So this is known as the tunneling effect in this book, and it's basically the equivalent of, when you're driving, they say you don't get tunnel vision and focus too much on one spot of the road. You need to kind of keep your head moving and focus on different areas. So that's something that we kind of see happen with the pressures of scarcity, is that people start to do the tunneling effect more. And it's a narrow-minded approach. So as I had kind of touched on previously, that there's a tax with tunneling, and so we focus so much on the tunneled task at hand that we get at this narrow view that I discussed in the prior slide. And anything that's deemed excess or out of the scope of that peripheral focus tends to get ignored. So an example of this that they provided in the book was talking about, you know, um, you're trying to save extra money for, a vacation during the holidays. And how are you going to do that? So an easy way to save money on things is to raise your deductible on insurance policies. So instead of having your car insurance policy cover the $500 and above after you pay your deductible, you can choose to actually make that like a $1,500 deductible where you're paying the first $1,500 in damages. And what this does is that it puts that impact of tunneling where you're so focused on saving for that vacation that you're not ignoring, or that you are ignoring those present effects of actually, you know, you're subsidizing yourself by focusing more on the long-term goal than thinking about the implications of if you have some sort of unexpected. So focusing versus tunneling is something that I kind of wanted to touch on. So through kind of reading this chapter and learning about both of the different effects, I felt that focus has a more positive effect, whereas tunneling is a more negative effect. The reason why for this is I feel like focus is something that it allows you to become more productive, and it has a lot more positive effects that come out of it, such as, you know, better work efficiency. You're able to multitask more effectively. And I related tunneling as a negative because I feel that tunneling has those negative implications where you're really killing yourself at work, you're putting in extra hours, and you're ignoring all other activities just for the sake of getting something done that you're extremely focused on, or to meet a certain goal financially or whatever it may be. So that brings us to our next topic, which is bandwidth. Bandwidth is kind of introduced in this book in the second section, and it's described as kind of our mental capacity and our total ability to kind of, you know, consume information and process things. It's our operating system of our brain, if you would say. And it allows us to focus and manage various tasks at once. And the more bandwidth you have, the more you can actually take on mentally. And that's determined by our IQ and our lifestyles and other things that we have going on in our life that would be consuming our thought process. So if you have a higher IQ, you have a much more widened ability to process and decipher different, you know, informational codes that are communicated to your brain. And also, if you have a lot more going on in your lifestyle, like say you're a single mother with kids and a job that you're trying to get promoted in, you're gonna have a lot more consuming your thought process, and that means that you have, you know, a wider bandwidth, but also less available bandwidth. So with that being said, there is also a bandwidth tax, and what it kind of alludes to is that scarcity of bandwidth also is cannibalizing our ability to think and process things rationally. So, different disruptions and distractions in our life can come into our mind and kind of consume that bandwidth that we had available. Say you have a member of your family die, you know, you're not able to focus on, you know, doing your job responsibilities that next day or whatever it may be, because that traumatic incident has impacted your life so severely. And assuming that it's someone that you're very close with, it's going to also consume a lot of your bandwidth because you're going to have all of your thoughts on, you know, all your memories of them and the things that you guys had done. And that's kind of a dark example, but those distractions and hard decisions with our life really tax that bandwidth and consume a lot of it, and break down our ability to process thoughts. And so when we're making these decisions, we can also be taxed on the impact of things such as worry and emotional trauma. So like I'd said, with losing a loved one, also with like fighting with one of your loved ones, consuming our decisions to make our decision making ability, and when we're making decisions without a full bandwidth, we can sometimes. The other thing too is that bandwidth is something that can be increased through effective management. So through juggling and proper management of our responsibilities and different activities, we can kind of free up some of that bandwidth. By choosing, you know, to maybe turn down that extra project to kind of make your boss happy, you could choose, you know, maybe you have to go home and, you know, manage your kids or do something other than work. Or and through proper management, you're really able to effectively manage that bandwidth, by juggling your responsibilities or finding ways to get free time. The example in the book is with the single mother who instead of having to watch her kids herself, what she does is she has that daycare at her office so that they're able to be watched there. And because of that, it takes that responsibility off of her mind, and she knows that they're nearby so that she can effectively kind of contribute her work to her workplace. So, reorganization and trade off based thinking are also another way that you can build some further bandwidth. You can find different types of programs and ways to achieve that based on what your goals are, um, and effectively kind of establish more bandwidth and free up some memory, you could say. So, the next major topic of this chapter, and through reading the book, was the topic of Slack. It kind of led in with a really great example of what Slack was, and it used an example of packing for a vacation to kind of provide that example. So, you have a large and a small suitcase, and as you're packing for vacation, we'll first start off with the large suitcase. So if you're using a large suitcase, you might pack, toiletries, business clothes, your, dresses, slacks, and everything, what it may be, and then also some electronics. And then you'll see, because if you're just packing for yourself, you're gonna have a lot of room left over, assuming you're packing reasonably. So you might decide to add extra things like maybe some more shoes or an umbrella or a rain jacket or a sweater in case it gets cold at night. And that's kind of the mentality that we have when we have slack or a larger amount of slack, opposed to when we have a smaller suitcase, which will represent the scarcity of slack. So when we have that smaller suitcase, there's a challenge presented to us as individuals where we're kind of dealing with that we have to make some sacrifices in that sense. You might not bring the extra pair of shoes. So next comes the topic of slack versus fat. So the difference between slack and fat is that fat is described as when businesses became very big in the 1970s and 80s. They started to become very cash heavy, and they had a more abundant supply of resources available to them to invest into different decisions. So with this abundance of resources, managers weren't, leveraging the best deals in the mind of the business, and they weren't, trying to get the best price possible on supply orders and everything like that. So they weren't, looking out for the best interests of the company. They were spending cash very frivolously, and were really just throwing money away and not worried about their bottom line because of this abundance of cash. They felt no pressure to actually do this. Also, the other thing too is that because they were spending the business's money rather than their own money, that they sort of had this feeling that they were emotionally unattached and had no incentives to really work hard to get the best possible deal. So through that, they felt that there was no purpose in actually negotiating a better deal. It was free money to them. So managers. So as I had kind of alluded to in prior sections, trade-offs are something that we're forced to kind of undergo due to the effects of scarcity on us in society. So trade-offs are decisions that are forced by slack, and they result due to the excess room or the lack of room. So when we have that lack of space, we have to make those decisions as to whether to bring that sweatshirt or not that I talked about earlier in the slack section. So it forces us to evaluate the positives and negatives and kind of perform cost benefit analysis and go through a more extensive decision making process than we typically would if we had more slack with the bigger suitcase example. So the last major topic that I really wanted to talk about was the failure to plan and how this is kind of forced with scarcity and the abundance of resources that we have at our disposal. In the book, they kind of allude to the topic of failing to plan And this is another thing that's caused by the tunneling effect. So, in various different circumstances, for my example, I'd like to talk about retirement. So, when we're first starting out with our jobs, we might have student loans and rent and other various expenses that are, more proactively approaching on their deadlines. So, we have to be more proactive in attending to those deadlines and paying those bills first. So what this forces us to do is have a myopic or nearsighted, short-sighted behavior where we're thinking long and we're thinking about, I should be putting money in my retirement account. However, because of these bills I have to pay, I don't have the opportunity or the luxury of doing that because, I have to pay off these bills before I can put money into my 401k or 403b, whatever it may be at the time. So this has a major impact in our retirement planning process. It's something that we've discussed in multiple finance courses here at St. Bonaventure. So just a few minutes here to wrap up on what I thought of scarcity. Overall, I really did enjoy reading this book. It was kind of cool to think about all these different things that we subconsciously process in our own minds when we're making decisions and kind of just going through our everyday life. um, in all the different applications of the various components such as trade-off, slack, and then examples where we have so much slack that it becomes fat and we're thinking myopically. Myopic behavior is something that I feel like is a fallacy we commit every day in our lives. And overall, I think that just being alerted to these topics of how we invest our money and the way we spend our resources, or how we manage time, and this book had so many different applications that you never really take time to think about. And overall, I would definitely recommend reading this book to some of my peers and other people interested in behavioral economics, because it talks about the sense of having more resources than you actually need to satisfy them. So that's something that we experience because we're not in poverty. But in other situations, you can think about it in places where you have more needs than actual resources, and you